Hi, everyone. This is
Hello.
Brian Miller from Catalyst Contemporary. I'm the director here, and I wanted to welcome you to our artist talk this evening for Remnants of a Mystical World. Director here. If any of my sitters have their mic on, there's a little reverb going on. Anyway, thanks for joining us. Catalyst Contemporary is located in Mount Vernon in Baltimore City. And this show is open until July 30th. Our regular hours are Wednesday through Saturday, 12 to 5. I just wanted to quickly introduce everyone. They'll have a chance to speak in just a minute. Behind the scenes, next to me, who you can't see, is Liz Faust, our gallery manager and assistant curator. She runs all of our technical experiments here online. Also joined tonight with 5 artists from the show: Geoff Robertson, Chrissy Fitchett, Kei Ito, Rebecca Marimutu, and Greg Dohler. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. For those of you that are listening live, you can comment if you like, and we will respond to any questions or comments that you might have throughout this talk. Just a few housekeeping things. As I mentioned, the show ends July 30th. We will be closed most of August and setting up and doing some painting and getting ready for our launch of our fall series. We have a solo show coming up with new artists that we're working with: Alberto Cavalieri out of Miami via Caracas, Venezuela. That show is called Have and Have Not and begins September 17th. I am, however, very excited to host the artists from the Remnants show. This is our first all photography-based show at the gallery in the 3 years that we've been running there. Of course, photography is one of my deep passions, and it was exciting to put this show together. It was really interesting, just sort of as an intro to the title that Liz and I were working on. When you're working with a bunch of artists for a long period of time and you want to put a show together that's a collection of their work, all of a sudden we realized that there was a thread through a lot of your work, and Rebecca, yours too, that we were recently introduced to, that was very strongly working well together. And that was this idea that a lot of you are dealing with worlds that are beyond us, are past us, our future, or even in the now, but there's this presence in the work that is a transcendent aspect that takes us to places that might be slightly familiar and unfamiliar at the same time, that pose questions about our own mortality, our own livelihood in this plane. And it was interesting to think about all of your work coming together around that nexus. So this idea that this remnant of a mystical world, this place that maybe is or maybe isn't, was a really interesting point to all of us. I wanted to give you each an opportunity to just introduce your work and just say a few words about where the work is coming from, where you made it, maybe how you made it, a little bit of the process, and then we'll go from there. I thought, Greg, that we might be able to start with you.
Yeah, hi. I think, Brian, what you said about creating pieces that are familiar and unfamiliar at the same time kind of describes my work kind of perfectly. I want to create scenes that are plausible, but when you look at everything, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. So it makes you feel a little disoriented. It feels very unfamiliar. And I'm not exactly sure why I kind of went that direction, but I think as I really thought about it, it seemed to kind of come down to just exploring the impermanence of everything, including ourselves, and also as you get older, you can very quickly find yourself, circumstances can change rapidly, and suddenly life can feel very disorienting or unfamiliar. And so I wanted the pieces to kind of feel like that, like where all of a sudden everything you thought you knew about your existence and everything around you maybe changes suddenly. And I made all these works, before the pandemic, before the kind of acceleration of climate change. But I think both of those things have kind of put us all in that space.
Absolutely. I think that's why they're really relevant when you look at a piece like November. It feels like a world that we might be living in. It's somewhat apocalyptic, but present too, especially if you're a Baltimorean. The buildings in the background are nearby. You're like, oh, is this the future? Like Planet of the Apes, where you see the
Statue of Liberty. Yeah, it's true.
Yeah. Well, Greg, thanks for that introduction. Chrissy, I'd like to move over to you. If you could tell us a little bit about the works in the show.
Sure. Yeah. So the photos in the show were all taken in Kathmandu, Nepal, several years ago. I was there initially with the Jan Meyer Traveling Fellowship to do a documentary project called Raising Daughters, Women of the Valley. And that series was really focused on generational female identity as it related to child rearing and especially education. So some of the images in the show were from that series, but then there's also several that were pulled later as I kind of went back into my archive from my time while I was in Nepal. So that was a really exciting process as well. And I'd say just to touch on a little bit of sort of how I think about things as a photographer, I'm definitely interested broadly in the idea of life cycles and generational knowledge. And then, our relationships to and memories that are attached to land. So it was, I found in going back into the series, there were a lot of these really, really quiet moments, kind of focused on singular objects or scenes that did sort of tap into this larger notion of sort of a mystical world living sort of in close proximity to the everyday.
Yeah, I mean, we were talking in the gallery a few weeks ago, I think it was probably at Open House, about the quietness of a lot of these images that are sort of after the fact of something, like the gurney, or what do you call that metal thing?
Stretcher,
Stretcher. It's a beautiful piece, but there's something, something's missing, and there's that sense of something missing in the work. And all the pieces in the show have this very quietness that's not absence, it's just quiet. Mm-hmm. And that's a really special thing about the work. And I think that's because you're working with the lens and film, I might add, sorry, that was me, to get to that point where you're bringing us to that moment of total stillness in contemplation of these special objects or special places, special time.
Yeah, I think it's also kind of speaks to just how photography inherently frames the world, and you can kind of present something. You can present the tone you want to present to some degree, because most of these spaces were actually quite bustling, busy spaces with a lot of activity going on, like right outside the frame. But I guess that's the beauty of the medium, is that you can kind of capture these in between moments where there is a lot of that stillness.
Sure, and that moment exists. I mean, you're showing us that moment exists. That's the beauty of the frame. Kei, I'd like to ask you to talk a little bit about the works in the show.
Sure. The quick context, I'm a cameraless photography. I don't use camera to make photograph. Specifically, the piece I included in the show is called a technique called chemigram. Essentially, I use specific oil, specifically honey and various oil, to create the shape on top of this black and white darkroom print. I came up with this idea while I was in the Center for Photography at Woodstock residency a few years back. There, I usually use C-print, but there they didn't have access to a C-print machine, so I decided to use black and white darkroom paper. Many of my artwork has some certain conceptual material significance of the reason why I use specific material. Many of my artwork has to deal with collective and individual trauma, specifically rooted to nuclear weapon or war, World War One, World War Two. And the more modern war as well. When I dig into some of the historical context, I found out so many people who didn't have access to the medicine used stuff like a vegetable oil or motor oil, and specifically honey, to pour over the burnt skin in order to use as a makeup medicine, including some of my family who was in Hiroshima when bombing came. So that's the inspiration I got from this piece. So many of my artwork is, even though it's abstract, it's always rooted to some specific story or specific event that takes place. Thus, I think the theme of this show kind of like matches with what I try to convey, that is invisible threat, but in the same time, I'm trying to materialize and visualize it in the form of the print. So,
In case people are wondering, if you're not familiar with C-print, that would be a chromogenic print that's made in the color darkroom, and you're working with papers that are like silver bromide, so black and white dark papers. Those physical elements that you're using on the papers is it's almost like a ritual practice in my mind, in reliving or retelling those moments and that story, perhaps as a healing process, but also just to memorize it, to memorize these things.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Thank you. Rebecca, would you talk to us a little bit about the pieces in the show?
Yeah. So my work is the self-portraits. I have two kind of methods that are going on in the work. So I have the pieces that we're looking at now, which are more print-oriented works. The two on the right are prints that I took digitally, and I printed them on transparencies and then manipulated them with paint and other kinds of chemicals. Most of my work is self-portraits, and I started doing that during the pandemic, for many reasons, partially because, you can't really interact with other people. But also it's a good time to like self-reflect and think about how I can use myself as, subject of my work. So that's the work that we're looking at now. And then the work that I started making, which is the collage work, is self-portraits printed on newsprint and copy paper, which I collage onto woodboard.
It's interesting to turn to yourself as a subject. It does seem like, hey, during the pandemic was like, hey, I've got me, and I've got all this me time to think about and reflect on and use as a vehicle for my thoughts. I find the work really engaging, and there's a lot of questions that come up, and maybe we'll get to those in a little bit, but just really drawn into the work, and of course the histories that are embedded in there we want to talk about a little bit coming up.
Yeah.
Geoff, I was wondering if you could introduce your work a little bit to us.
Sure. So the pieces that are displayed in this exhibition, they were all taken sometime between 2017 and 2019, either in Baltimore or in Locust Hill, Virginia, which is a small town on the Rappahannock River, kind of in eastern Virginia. And the commonalities that kind of exist across them, first and foremost, they're all done inside of a controlled setting. All my photography is done in a kind of controlled studio, a light controlled studio, where I am working with the presentation of different kinds of light to create different effects. And nothing's done in post-production. All the content that you see there is captured actually in camera. But the commonalities that kind of exist across them are also what I believe, kind of tie them into the theme of this exhibition itself. And I'll kind of dive into them. There's about three. That which is kind of visible in terms of the visual light spectrum, the element of time, and then the element of kind of another form of perception, our perception as binocular vision animals, like depth perception. And so I'll go into those real quickly. When it comes to like the visual light spectrum, the electromagnetic spectrum that exists in the universe, all the energy in the universe, we only see like a very, very small percentage of it. It's like less than 0.01% of the electromagnetic spectrum is actual visual spectrum. And on either ends of the visual spectrum are infrared, we see to red, and then we get into infrared, and then we see down to kind of like violet, and then there's ultraviolet. And ultraviolet is where all of these photographs reside. Everything is done with a UV light, a black light, as we kind of call them. And so we're dealing with the edges of the actual visual light spectrum. I think this is important when it comes to the theme of mysticism, because mysticism deals with that which is not necessarily perceived. It's like not necessarily getting into our cognition and into our intellect, because our sensory organs aren't geared to actually pick it up and bring it into the locked room that is our brain. So I like dealing with that kind of light because it really pushes the boundaries of like what the human can actually pick up. Then when it comes to time, the other kind of element that I'm working with here, a lot of my stuff is done as long exposures. This one in particular, Liz, that you have up here is probably the longest one in terms of the exposure time, where I've opened the camera shutter and I am exposing light, or turning on lights inside this controlled studio, moving the camera, turning on the lights again, moving the camera, turning on the lights again, moving the camera, turning on the lights again, and then closing the shutter. So it is a single exposure. It's one long exposure. So here is an element of time, but it also brings in this other element that I was talking about, that of like depth perception. The reasons that our brain pick up depth is that we have two eyes that look at the world from two slightly different angles, and our brain interprets that as perceived depth. And what you see here is a situation, Liz, want to bring the photo back up. The situation where you have different angles of the subject being presented to you. And if you were able to kind of cross them over in a way in your brain, you would actually see a sense of depth, like a three-dimensional effect on the subject itself. And I think, now that I'm thinking about it, the whole concept of the electromagnetic spectrum and the energy, this kind of like tease it up for Kei, because I think that the work that you have here, also gets into that in a way, and the very interesting story behind your work. I don't know if you're ready to segue into that, Brian, but I do think that that's a very interesting story that can be kind of taken off of the electromagnetic spectrum topic.
Well, absolutely. I mean, as artists all working in different practices within a photographic medium, I mean, we do cover the spectrum here in terms of techniques. Maybe that's a segue that it can lead to the more narrative aspects of all the pieces. The one thing that I was thinking about while all of you were talking, and again, this is both on the practical side of making work, but also in the context of the work, like where you're at when you're making it, is this tension or balance, or I don't know. It could be a tension. It could be a balance between like control versus chaos. Geoff, your work is extremely controlled. Greg, your work is controlled by the elements that you do. And if you're a photographer like Chrissy or Rebecca pointing a lens at something, you're controlling those things. But there's also this amount of letting things happen before you. Particularly Chrissy, you're documenting. You're not like you're not controlling the situation. There's a certain amount of chaos that is the world out there in front of you. Kei, you deal specifically with a lot of chaos in the work. It's controlled chaos, but it is certainly about movement and body and practice. Is there a talking point here for you guys that you want to jump onto a little bit about the making of work, or that idea of the internal mechanisms for control and chaos, either in context or in creation?
Sure. I think I'm gonna start first, I guess. So like, as I say, I'm a cameraless photography, but even though like so many of my work is more, as you say, Brian, it was more controlled, but this one specifically uses almost like a painting like process, like because I need to physically apply these honeys or different kind of oil with a paintbrush, placing the prints on the ground and kind of using my body to create these shapes and stuff. So in a way, this is like a hybrid of the painting and photography, and there it feels like it's a lots of like a hybrid and more performative element comes across. I have so under my skin, the piece it's in the gallery. I have a larger piece called Burning Away. Currently, it's displayed at Full Circle, one of the stuff, and I have some of the stuff in process right now. But it's 40 inches by 96 inches. It's pretty large scale. Brian knows, but that was specifically very like performative because I need to move entire body and everything, and you know. And I love making one of the kind print because, you know, I think what people usually think about photography is, oh, it's a reproducible, thus it's less valuable. And I always hated that notion of that. You know, look at the painters, you know, they can paint stuff, put it on the wall without having glass framed. It's on the canvas and sell it for like way more expensive than photography. Meanwhile, I think photography is as precious as any, but only reason people buy it cheaply is because how easily it can make duplicates.
Sure.
So here I'm trying to create one of the kind print. And I think, Rebecca, I think you're trying to do the similar thing with your collage, because collage is a much more hands-on, one of the kind object. And I think I think like there's something like mystical, you know, like spirituality comes again, like it's almost this preciousness aura that object can have when it's a single piece, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Rebecca, is there a intended temporalness of the work, temporality of the wheat pasted pieces that you're interested in?
Yeah, definitely. I'm definitely aware of the materials that I'm using in that work, and I think that for me, coming from like a photo background, I think that there is this kind of pressure to make longevity, like work has like longevity, but it kind of creates work that I feel like can be stagnant in a way. And so I think what I'm trying to do, or what I was trying to do with this work, was break away from some material hierarchies in creating work and play with materials that are easily accessible, but approach them in unique ways. But going back to the question that you asked before, I definitely feel like my work is very chaotic. The picture taking process is also chaotic, but I think a little controlled. But I think for me, it's a very like process oriented thing. Like I put a lot of my current state into the work that I'm making. Whatever thoughts or things that are on my mind is what goes into it. And I want to kind of play with the, even with my more recent work, the more painterly works or that I'm making, just like play with the medium as much as I can.
Mhm. Yeah, in recent works, I'm not sure if we have any of those here. You're literally like paintbrushing on colors and whatnot into the image, or it appears so you can see brush strokes and things like that.
Yeah, those are prints.
Yeah, yeah.
They're physical. They're physically made, but I scan and print them.
Yeah, they're reproduced. Yeah,
They're reproducible.
yeah, Chrissy.
Yeah, I was just thinking of this idea of kind of control versus chaos. And I'm just thinking about like in my own work, I have, as I mentioned, like an interest in life cycles and definitely our relationship to death. And I think that part of what's interesting to me about those concepts is that they're so hard to pin down in the physical world, and yet we experience them so vividly in our emotional lives. And so I've found that photography can be kind of an exciting medium to explore some of these ideas that are a little bit hard to find physically in the world in a literal sense. Just because you are dealing a little bit, at least in the way that I work, like dealing a little bit more with like incidental, the world as it just is around you and you as part of that world as well. Not having, I definitely struggle with that like blank page feeling where, photography kind of eliminates that, where you're always working with the people around you and the scene around you and just the sensory world, you're experiencing it. And so I think that, while there's still a lot of control ultimately in what you're shooting and how you're shooting it and framing, as we mentioned, I think just that kind of that spirit of discovery, which in some cases can feel like chaos, allows me to interact with the world. It's a little bit closer to like a poetic approach to visuals, sort of drawing from what I'm seeing and rearranging it rather than necessarily knowing where I'm going to end up when I'm starting.
Well, you definitely work in an instantaneous mode where you're trying to connect everything that's spinning around in here and what you're seeing to that moment in front of you. It's, not to be cliche, but going back to, Cartier-Bresson's like that decisive, like, oh my God, there's a connection here between something that's happening in here and that chaos that's outside, for sure. Greg, you were going to respond to something. You want to turn your mic on?
It's not on?
It is.
Okay. Okay. No, I was just looking at Rebecca's collages. It just struck me the sense of movement in them is just really, really striking. And it kind of reminded me of a lot of the kind of films of the 60s, like Blow Up and like French New Wave, just this like energy, this like playfulness but edgy too. But anyway, just the way you place all those images in the collage and the kind of diagonal lines and it just a lot of energy and just a lot of movement, sense of movement.
Cool.
You're like, what a great analogy.
Yeah, well, I'll look into French New Wave.
There you go.
It's interesting, this idea of the actually circling back to Geoff's comment about the seen and unseen, the visible and the invisible, these things that go on as an artist, as a photographer, that process that's going on inside of you, these things happening outside of us that we're all of us as artists, I am grouping myself in there, but you guys, the element of trying to control something that we ultimately don't have a lot of control over, as a way to poetically define or communicate or express something. These things are pretty fascinating. Again, an underlying element to the visual connections and the context for the work in the show, of course. Geoff, this idea of visible and invisible control and chaos. I mean, you're like trying to push our conceptual boundaries as well as visual boundaries by literally like building machines that twirl light and move light, and cameras that are, a camera that's moving it around an object or getting multiple angles at an object, really confusing our brains. But in a sense, it's probably the way our brains are actually like get all the information as it is. Taking in all this data, it's that consciousness filtration that allows us to hone in and not see everything at once, because it would just explode. It'd be like scanners and our head would blow off. Do you want to talk just a little bit about that technical thing? Because that is something that's very intriguing about your art making is the control and the process and the engineering aspects of building scenes, where like this is the opposite of what Chrissy's talking about. It's like that sense of discovering something out there that resonates with something in there. You're like, I see something, or I'm thinking of something, and I want to make it visual. I want to interpret it visually.
Sure. It comes with a little bit of a story and kind of how I've worked into this process. And my background is not in photography. It's not in art. It's in something called human factors and applied cognitive psychology. For many years, I worked for companies testing how humans interacted with their products. I study how people think as they interact with technology. And so I was out in Chicago for business, and I was just playing around with this old camera that I had. I bring that up because my background ties a lot into what I do and kind of how I think about the perception of things. But I'll get to that in a minute. But from a vocational standpoint, I was out in Chicago for work once, and I was out at night taking street photography, and I started playing with the exposure time of the camera, capturing the light of vehicles as they pass by over bridges in downtown Chicago. And I think it was like 2 or 3 in the morning. I was out really late. It was really cold, and I realized that I was like standing next to some very disgusting stuff on the sidewalk. And I was like, there's got to be a better way to be able to experiment with capturing light. Because at that point, again, I don't have a formal background in photography, but it kind of dawned on me that photography was really the art of capturing light over time. Often photographs are very fast. You're getting very quick, light that's being captured. But if you're able to really manipulate that light and the setting in which it's in, then you can really start generating some bizarre stuff. And so from there, I started progressively getting more and more technical in terms of how I control that light and how I present that light to a camera, all within a single exposure. The shutter opens, light comes into it, how I've decided to present it to it, and then I close the shutter. And so over time, I started building more and more apparatuses that help me control that light, move that light. The video that Liz had up a moment ago, I guess you got a couple of them kind of spinning lights, as a result of a device that I built in 2020. That was like my COVID project that I called the Halo machine. And basically the Halo machine gave me, it afforded me control over, this is a great video, the spin, the position of light around a subject. So here I can control how fast it's moving. I can control, design these various light rigs that I would hook up to the machine, and then I'd spin it around subjects, and then it would result in something. So it's a very controlled situation. I'm building something that allows me to control things, but there is very much an element of chance, right, to what you're going to capture in that. Again, not having any formal background in photography, learning how to manually operate a camera. What are the best settings? Like, what aperture do you want? Like, what ISO, all these, like, I don't know, like, it was like me experimenting with this stuff in a basement, is how I went about creating these images. Hopefully that is getting into answering your question.
Yeah. Greg, how much of your, I'm going to segue. Kei, do you want to respond to that?
Oh yeah. Oh, well, not just that, but like I had the specific question for the Greg, because we're talking about chaos and like chance and stuff, and like to me, like I always think we kind of deal with a similar theme of like not the post-apocalyptic, but kind of like almost end of the world like scenery sometime. And I was wondering like where is your like inspiration comes from? Because is it a movie? Because like we never seen the end of the world yet, and like we can only imagine that, right? So like where is your inspiration comes from? I just want to ask you that.
Well, I am a very vivid, prolific dreamer, and that's and I've always been fascinated with the way in dreams you can have like a commingling of a lot of different memories. My dreams tend to be very real, but they'll incorporate elements of something that may have happened earlier that day, but then I might be interacting with some, a long deceased relative. Or I might be a child and I'm hanging out with my friends, but it's very real. And so it's just interesting to me that these memories are so real in the brain that they can sort of form these new scenes and these little plays in your brain while you sleep. So that was definitely kind of trying to duplicate that feel of something that's so real, but then you wake up and you think about all the individual elements of that dream, and you say, "That's crazy." Why? So I was definitely intrigued by that, and also definitely influenced by film noir. I watch a lot of black and white films from the 1930s and 40s, so I love dramatic black and white tones. And then also too, it was just kind of embracing technology a little bit. I was a journalist for many years. I couldn't alter an image at all. And so I thought, well, just to have fun in my personal life, I will, play with the technology. And I'm also, I don't mind sitting for 5 hours and blending images together by hand, and just losing track of time. That's like my idea of a good time. So I was kind of predisposed to this kind of style of blending images together. So that's kind of, where it all comes from.
It's interesting. Geoff was saying something, and we went to Kei and back to you, and Geoff was talking about the total concept of photography being capturing light over time. And it's fascinating because light is this like constant thing, right? It's really this like static thing. It's this energy. And I'm thinking about how all of us, all of you, are capturing light or dealing with light sensitive materials, light as projection. Greg, even you mentioned these images or memories from childhood commingling with all this other information that often gets filtered out. Our brain is constantly like trying to rectify like reality versus, well, when I mean something concrete, like our daily thing versus all these other things that are going on in our brain. So this idea of like capturing light over time and how it's all blended together in our minds is totally fascinating to me. I mean, just as a philosophical thought on photography and our human experience of the light we're all seeing, impressing things in our brain, whether they're memories, or visions or past life or any ways you want to describe all of this. It's a really interesting concept.
Yeah, and when I pull all the images in my work are all shot by me over the years. Although there's a few like old family snapshots that I've blended in here and there. But when I have to find the elements, they all have to kind of be lit similarly. The light can't be hitting one thing one way and the other thing the other way. So everything, you know, all of these images were taken at different time, different locations, different times, different years, but they're all being lit the same way, and it's usually by a natural source, by the sun. So there is a commonality in all of these things, that, even though they weren't present at the same time,
or they were. We are coming up towards the end of our talk, sort of the last third, and was thinking that we could sort of dig in a little more to individual works. Is there any work for you all in the show, and feel free to jump in, that really stands out and transmits something essential to your body of work, or you're either within the show or in the context of the show, or your larger, you know, métier?
It's a kind of hard question.
That's a big question. One piece to define my entire.
Well, maybe it doesn't. I mean, you know, but is there something that speaks, you know, volumes, so that when, you know, people who are listening now want to jump into the gallery in the next week or so, they can, you know, take a gaze at that one and start to contextualize everything that we've talked about.
Well, I want to say not just particularly my piece, but like I love this particular exhibit, because this exhibit doesn't take photography as what most of the people think as is. Every photographer in the show kind of like approaching photography in different way. Like, you know, as you know, Geoff and Greg was talking about, like, you know, photography is a chance, and like when we deconstruct photography, like, what is it going to be? Like, is collage still photography? If you rip the photograph, still photography? Do you use specific camera to be a photography? Do you need to even use camera to be a photography? And I think like every piece in the show has such an interesting way of like contemplating and approach photography in such a new age of the photography. And I think that's like really fascinating. And that's why I think this show is like really exciting, not just in the context of like photography, but it's just a visual art. I think that's like a new thing that what we need to think about is maybe, you know, like photography could be, you know, like so many different things, you know, like, you know, still respect the original aspect, but it could be much more, you know, like, so that I think this show is fascinating. I just want to mention that.
It's so true. I mean, photography has struggled throughout its history to like compete and compare and go through different phases of trying to verify itself. And in that process, whether it was necessary or not is not really an issue. But throughout that process, it's really pushed the medium to do so many different things. And certainly in the context of this show, there are, you know, 6 different photographers approaching the use of light sensitive materials, digital camera technologies, film technology, photographic papers, and all sorts of things in a lot of different ways. And it certainly shows that there's no standardization within the medium. And it certainly shows what the medium is, the broad range of the medium, and what's capable within that, and to successfully.
I think, you know, there are fewer technological barriers to getting into photography. You know, I mean, once upon a time, you would have had to learn how to operate a camera manually. You would have learned how to go into a dark room, need access to a dark room, And I think it's, it's funny because a lot of people say to me, well, do you resent the fact that it's easier to and I'm like, no, I think it's great because I think people who just have a great eye and might have been afraid previously, they now can jump in and start showing the world what they see, which is great.
Yeah. Well, if you think about it, I mean, Kodak was doing that in the late 1800s, early 1900s anyway. I mean, so many, not everyone, but the proliferation of camera technology was pretty magnificent. It wasn't access for all. I don't want to get that wrong. It was not access for all. But it's that proliferation has been going on and growing and growing. And you're right, Kei, with the advent of that thing you held up. It certainly I feel like it does challenge you all as photography-based artists in what you're working on, to compete with the proliferation of images in our world, period. What do you do? Do you give up and be like, well, everybody's saying everything that needs to be said? I don't believe that. And I believe that even that thought can push you even further in the work that you're doing. Certainly everything that you can see in this show is unique.
Yeah, I was just thinking, going back to your question about kind of there's a singular piece. I don't know if you mean in our own work or in the show in general, but I was just thinking about some of Erika's pieces, especially the, I don't want to get it wrong, but I think it's How to Tan a Rattlesnake. Is that right?
Yes.
And I think like in the context of this conversation and just thinking about these ideas, a lot of us, it sounds like, are working with like questions more than answers in our work. And so I definitely think that it's great how, Erika's pieces kind of lay out these questions in a more explicit way. Just being able to see, sort of a process of working out your idea about something in this physical object, using visuals, but also using words and that handwritten text as well. I just think is a great complement to all the work in the show, and really brings this idea of questioning and just interrogating the world around us and our spiritual lives in a really rich way.
Absolutely. I wish Erika was here to explain it a little bit more. I don't want to even begin to try and put words in her mouth, but I have known her for quite some time and been working with her work for a few decades. She is certainly someone who reaches out across the boundaries between the seen and the unseen, works with cultures who believe and interact with that unseen world in many different ways. And her work specifically addresses those connections as best as it can through the medium of photography. And it certainly offers us a lot of questions. It also looks through time and throughout time, or timelessness, like it looks into the now as a connection between all of those. There's Erika for you. Her work certainly is a touch point for the visible versus the invisible in a very concrete way, in a sense, because a lot of what she's looking at is the past versus the present, or the past within the present, or vice versa. So that's a great point to bring up, Chrissy. Thank you for including those images as well. Are there any other topics that you guys want to touch on about the show, about the work in the show, or the directions? Actually, what I'm really interested in, has this work made you think about your own work differently in the context of the show and in relationship to each other's work? That's something that's actually been on my mind a lot. I'm always interested when we do group shows and we're putting work together from different artists that may not have shown together, and what happens, like what kind of chemistry happens there that you are able to reflect upon. And maybe that's a good way to kind of wrap up if everybody has some response to that. Geoff?
Yeah, hopefully this is in line with what you're asking. But I was mentioning this kind of at the beginning because I feel like a connection specifically with Kei and the story, particularly the story behind your work that's in there. And I was talking about how, the visual spectrum in terms of all of the electromagnetic spectrum out there is only one very sliver. But, as humans, we've harnessed more of it outside of that for our benefit. You have radio waves, you have microwaves, and then you get into infrared, which we use for heat. Then we get into visual light, then we get into ultraviolet light, then we get into X-rays, and then we start getting into gamma rays, and we start getting into radiation and the actual very harmful radiation. And I think that was the connection that I would not have made between us if it wasn't for the show here. Just kind of thinking about that and how it, I'm focused on one very small part of the electromagnetic spectrum, and your story is founded on a little bit further down. And I just thought that was a really cool connection.
No, I definitely I was gonna mention about this idea of capturing invisible, and that could mean so many things. But I always like to approach the matter in more fun, more grounded way, in a way of using a specific material, specific, not scientific, but certain what would you call it? Certain anchor point to the piece, and you are actually using certain spectrum of the light, and you using actuality of these material to make these invisible visible, and to me that was really eye-opening, and kind of made me want to touch camera again, which I haven't really done for a long time. And Rebecca, the collage and everything, I always consider every single work I make as a self-portrait as well, because so many piece I make has some certain part of me, or me as Japanese American immigrant or third generation evil victim, or the product of the war. I don't know what it is, but I always consider every single piece has me in it. So I really resonated with what you said about so many work you make is self-portrait. I completely agree with you. Even though some of the artwork doesn't have physical face or body in the photograph, it still is a self-portrait. And I think to me that's very important, and tend to photographer forget, because we are the photographer, usually the one who sits behind the camera and subjects in front of you, but sometimes the photographer needs to step into the step into the imagery. Sometimes it feels so. I was resonated with what you did, Rebecca. So no, thank you about that.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree. I sometimes after I started making this work, I looked at some of my older work, and I realized that I was kind of making portraits. There still had parts of me in them too. And I think even though a lot of the work even other work that's not necessarily of yourself, you make work that's not of yourself, but you are controlling a lot of the lighting, or the staging, and where the composition of that work, and that is kind of part of who you are, and what your eye is drawn to, and what your personal interests are, or else you wouldn't really be taking that photograph in the first place. So I do think that even though I think a lot of times people feel photography can be a very objective medium, it's actually very, I think, personal in a way, because everyone has their own thing all of us have our own specific thing that we're interested in the medium of photography, and it's all different. And the way that we approach it is very different, but we're all using a very simple, basic, or except for okay, but we're all using a camera, more or less, to create that work. So we're all using the same tool.
There is a really interesting connection between Geoff, not to leave you out, but between Chrissy, Rebecca, Kei, Greg, and Erika, this concept of body and history of body and intergenerational connections. Greg, your memories of the past, you're using photographs, family photographs. Kei tracing his family's history, from the war forward, literally in his own body. Same with you, Rebecca, your personal history as a human being, as a genetic connection going to the past. And Chrissy, your interest too in that with your own family. Erika deals with that and looking at her her subjects, like whether she's embedded in a culture somewhere. And that's a really interesting connection. The body and the generational aspects of that. I hadn't thought openly about those connections either. That's fascinating to me.
Yeah,
sorry, go ahead. No, go ahead. Chrissy, I was gonna say, like, even the Geoff's project is like, just because like like we think of like these spectrum, the light, and when you said that, I immediately thought about like the light coming from the space. Like some of these light we see today up the sky is
Right.
the light reflected from like ancient long time ago, and some of the new image NASA revealed is is invisible light that human eye can't capture, but it's also like a capturing what it is. So like to me, like it extends the body to like a human body to like planetary body. Like to me, like that distinction can be like such a like large scale thing, but to me, like that's also applied to what Geoff's doing in like really conceptual level.
Sure. Chrissy, you wanted to follow up with a comment?
Yeah, I'll be really brief. I was just going to say that something I've definitely taken from being a part of the show with all of you is just really appreciating like the spirit of experimentation that I think is present in everyone's work. And it's just been really inspiring to me to see different artists approaching some of these same questions through such different media and practices. Like I'm totally fascinated by Geoff's just the process of building these machines in and of itself. Like these machines are so beautiful. So yeah, it's been really exciting to kind of think about alternate approaches to similar interests, and that's been just really exciting to be part of.
Thank you. Well, I think it's a good point to wrap up on. I've really enjoyed working with you guys on this show. Rebecca, you're new to our roster, and it's been really exciting getting to know your work. I've been working with Geoff and Greg and Chrissy and Kei for a number of years now. I hope we continue to work with you. And thanks again. Just a reminder to those who are listening now that the show is up till July 30th. We're open Wednesday through Saturdays, 12 to 5. We're also open by appointment. You can contact us through our email. And again, thanks everyone. It's very enjoyable and very interesting to know a little bit more about everyone's work and where you're coming from. So thanks again.
Thank you so much.
Thanks Brian and Liz.
Thank